Welcome to another deep dive with us. We're going to be looking at the English language today.
Yeah.
Some interesting words and phrases.
Yeah, it's amazing. We use language every day,
Right.
but we don't always think about where the words come from and how they've evolved over time.
Yeah, exactly. And today we're going to be looking at two terms that are very common that
Hmm.
you've probably heard before, but hopefully by the end of this you'll have a new appreciation for them.
Absolutely.
So the first one that we wanted to look at is to turn down.
Okay.
And I was reading an article the other day about this phrase, and it really is fascinating how it went from something very literal
Mm.
to something much more abstract. And I think,
Yeah, so to turn down basically means to reject or refuse something.
right,
And the literal act of like reducing volume, so like turning down the knob on a radio
right.
became this metaphor for politely decreasing the intensity of a request or an offer.
Yeah. And so it's very interesting how it almost softens the blow. It's exactly rather than saying like a flat no.
Yeah.
You're kind of saying, well, maybe under different circumstances.
Yeah, it's a way of preserving relationships while still setting boundaries.
Right, exactly. And it's interesting how that physical action of turning that knob
Mm-hmm.
became associated with this more kind of nuanced social interaction.
Right.
Right.
And there are more formal synonyms you can use if you want to express the same idea
Oh, yeah.
in like a more professional setting, like reject, refuse, or decline.
Yeah, I've even heard disallow in certain like legal contexts.
Oh, right.
Which
Absolutely.
just adds another
Oh.
layer of formality to it. But okay, so ready to move on to our next word?
Yeah.
Okay, so this one's really interesting because it has two very distinct meanings.
Okay.
We're talking about to run into.
To run into. Yeah, this is a great example of how context is everything in language.
Right.
So on one hand, it can mean to encounter someone unexpectedly.
Right, like bumping into a friend at the grocery store.
It's exactly like you're walking down the aisle and suddenly there's your old teacher from high school.
And you're like, oh, hey.
Yeah. And then on the other hand, to run into can describe a collision,
Right.
often kind of an unpleasant one,
Yeah.
like a car running into a tree during a storm.
It's amazing how those two meanings, both involving this idea of like a sudden impact,
Yeah.
evolve from that same phrase.
Yeah. And for the first meaning, like that unexpected meeting,
Right.
there are other synonyms you could use, like encounter, meet, or come across, but they don't quite have that element of surprise
Right. They lack that.
that run into conveys.
That run into has.
Exactly.
And for the collision meaning of it, you could say like crash, hit, or collide.
Mhm.
But run into seems to suggest a less forceful impact.
Right.
Like you wouldn't say a train ran into a building,
Right.
but you might say like a shopping cart ran into a display
Yeah. Yeah. That's a great observation.
at the grocery store.
The choice of words can really subtly change the listener's perception.
Of the event run into
Yeah.
has a certain informality to it.
Yeah.
Whereas like crash or collide, those feel much more
Right.
deliberate or severe.
Much more forceful.
Yeah.
Right. And it all depends on the effect you're trying to create,
Exactly.
which makes me wonder if you were like writing a novel or something,
Mm-hmm.
would you choose to use run into or one of the other synonyms?
That's a good question.
Like what factors would you consider in choosing that word?
Well, I think I would consider the tone of the scene,
Right.
the relationship between the characters,
Right.
maybe even the historical period of the story.
Oh, interesting.
For example, if I was writing a humorous scene set in modern times,
Right.
I might use like bumped into to
Yeah.
really emphasize
Yeah.
that lightheartedness of the encounter.
Yeah.
But if it was a dramatic scene set in like the 19th century,
Right.
then I might choose encounter to evoke that sense of formality
Yeah.
and gravity.
Yeah, that's really interesting.
Yeah, and it really highlights how language is almost like a tool
It is.
that writers can use to shape the reader's experience.
Exactly.
Do you think that's something most people are aware of when they're reading?
I think most people probably pick up on those nuances subconsciously.
Right.
They may not be able to articulate why a particular word choice feels right or wrong,
Right.
but it definitely affects their overall impression of the story.
Right. It's almost like the secret code embedded in the language.
Yeah.
And so when we're talking about these words and phrases, we're not just defining them, we're also kind of uncovering these hidden messages.
Absolutely. And that's what makes language so intriguing.
Right.
It's not just a way to convey information, it's a way to connect with others on a deeper level,
Right.
to evoke emotions, to create shared meaning.
And it makes you realize how much power we hold
Hmm.
in our words and how important it is to use them thoughtfully and deliberately.
Absolutely.
So before we move on to our next word, I want to ask you about what has stood out to you the most. It's kind of like to turn down and run into. Have you noticed any subtle shifts in their usage over time?
Well, it's really fascinating how the meaning of a word
Right.
can change depending on the context, the
Yeah.
speaker's intention,
Yeah.
and even the listener's interpretation.
Oh, wow.
It's like this constant negotiation of meaning.
It's like we're all playing this game almost.
Yeah.
This language game, using words as our pieces,
Yeah.
trying to convey our thoughts and feelings as accurately as possible.
Yeah, and sometimes that game gets even more complex when we encounter words
Right.
that are designed to express the inexpressible.
Right.
Which brings us to our next term,
Okay.
ineffable.
Ineffable. There's just something about that word that's just
It's a powerful word.
so powerful. Yeah.
It carries a sense of awe and wonder.
Yeah.
It's often used to describe experiences that are so profound or overwhelming
Right.
that language just can't do them justice.
Right.
Think of like standing at the edge of the Grand Canyon,
Well.
witnessing the vastness of space,
Yeah.
feeling the unconditional love of a parent for their child.
Yeah.
These are all moments that might be considered ineffable.
And it's like the word itself is acknowledging the limitations of language.
Yeah.
You know, saying that there are just some things you can't really express.
Right, exactly.
You have to just experience them.
And yet, paradoxically, we still try to capture those experiences with words.
Yeah, we try. We do.
Using metaphors and similes to kind of bridge the gap
Yeah.
between the ineffable and the expressible.
Right. And it makes me think of all the poetry and literature
Oh, yeah.
that attempts to describe the indescribable.
Absolutely.
Do you have any like favorite examples of writers who
Well,
try and grapple with this concept of ineffability?
Well, Walt Whitman's poetry often touches on,
Yeah.
the transcendent, the mystical, the things that lie beyond everyday language.
Yeah.
And then there's Emily Dickinson,
Right.
who uses this very concise, almost cryptic language to hint at the depths of human experience.
Right.
Both of them, in their own unique ways, wrestle with the challenge
Yeah.
of expressing the ineffable.
And it's almost like they're inviting the reader to participate
Yes.
in that act of meaning making.
Exactly.
To fill in the gaps with their own imagination and experiences.
Right.
Which leads me to a question. If we can't fully express the ineffable,
Yeah.
why do we even bother trying?
That is a profound question.
Yeah.
And I think the answer lies in our inherent need to connect with others,
Ooh.
to share our experiences, even if those experiences
Yeah.
defy easy categorization.
Right.
Even if we can't fully capture the essence of the ineffable,
Yeah.
the very act of trying brings us closer to understanding it
Right.
and to sharing that understanding with others.
Oh, it's not about finding the perfect words. It's more about just creating a space for shared contemplation.
Yes.
For acknowledging that mystery and wonder that exists beyond the boundaries of language.
It's about recognizing the limits of language,
Right.
but at the same time pushing those limits,
Yeah.
stretching them as far as they can go
Wow.
to encompass that vastness of human experience.
That makes me think about all the times we might encounter the ineffable, not just in, these grand, awe-inspiring moments,
Right.
but also in everyday interactions.
Yes.
Like a fleeting feeling of joy, a sudden sense of peace,
Yeah.
a moment of deep connection with another person.
That's a beautiful observation.
Yeah.
The ineffable isn't limited to these extraordinary experiences.
Right.
It can be found in the ordinary, the mundane,
Yeah.
the seemingly insignificant moments that make up our lives.
It's about cultivating that sense of awareness.
Yes.
That openness.
An openness to the mystery and wonder
Yeah.
that permeates our existence,
It's everywhere.
even in the most unexpected places.
Yeah, and that awareness can help us appreciate the power of language.
Yeah.
Not just as a tool for communication, but as a means of exploration.
Exactly.
A way of delving into the depths of ourselves and the world around us.
I love that.
Yeah. And speaking of exploration,
Okay.
I'm curious to hear your thoughts on our next phrase, to give up.
To give up, okay.
It's a phrase that often carries these negative connotations,
It does.
but I have a feeling there's more to it than meets the eye.
You're absolutely right.
Yeah.
To give up is often associated with
Right.
failure, weakness, a lack of perseverance.
Right. Yeah.
But I think it's important to remember that context is everything.
Right.
Sometimes giving up can actually be a sign of wisdom.
Oh,
A recognition that a particular path is no longer serving us,
right.
and that it's time to shift directions.
So it's not necessarily about admitting defeat,
Hmm.
but about making a conscious choice
Yeah,
to redirect our energy towards something
that's
more
it.
fulfilling or aligned with our values.
Think of a scientist who's been working on a research project for years, and then they finally realize that their hypothesis was flawed.
Right.
Giving up on that particular line of inquiry
Yeah.
doesn't mean they've failed as a scientist.
Right.
It simply means they're open to exploring new avenues,
Right. Yeah.
refining their approach based on the evidence they've gathered.
It takes courage, though,
It does.
to recognize when it's time to let go of something,
It does.
even if you've invested time and energy in it.
Absolutely. It's about recognizing that our paths aren't always linear.
Right.
There will be detours and setbacks along the way.
Yeah.
Sometimes the most courageous act is to acknowledge those setbacks
Right.
and choose a different direction.
And that act of choosing can be incredibly empowering.
It can.
Like, it reminds us that we have agency in our lives.
Exactly.
We're not just passive recipients of circumstance.
To give up can be a way of reclaiming our agency,
Right.
of taking control of our narratives and shaping our destinies.
It's about letting go
Yes,
to make space for what we want.
exactly. It's interesting how this phrase,
Yeah.
which on the surface seems so simple,
Right.
can actually encompass such a wide range of meanings and interpretations.
I'm sure our listeners have their own personal experiences
I'm sure.
with giving up, both positive and negative.
Absolutely. I'd be curious to hear their reflections.
Yeah.
What situations come to mind when they think about this phrase?
Right.
What factors influence their decision to give up on something
Yeah.
or to persevere despite the challenges?
Those are great questions to ponder.
Yeah.
And perhaps by exploring these nuances,
Mm,
we can gain a deeper understanding of ourselves and the choices we make.
absolutely.
Before we move on to our final thoughts,
Okay.
I wanted to ask you what has resonated most with you
All right.
about ineffable and to give up. What connections do you see
Mm.
between these two seemingly disparate phrases?
Well, what strikes me is that they both have this kind of paradoxical nature.
Yeah,
Trying to express the ineffable
right.
and then recognizing the power in giving up.
It seems like there's this balance between striving for something and knowing when to let go.
It's almost like a dance, isn't it?
It is, yeah.
We push forward, we reach for understanding, we try to articulate those things that move us so deeply.
Yeah,
And then at a certain point,
right,
we have to surrender.
right.
We have to accept that some things just remain beyond our grasp.
Yeah,
And it's in that surrender, that letting go,
yeah.
that we often find new insights and perspectives.
So we need both.
Yeah.
That drive to express and the willingness to release,
I get
to
it.
really fully engage with the world and with ourselves.
And maybe those seemingly contradictory ideas
Right.
aren't so contradictory after all.
Right.
Maybe they're two sides of the same coin,
Yeah.
two essential aspects of the human experience.
That's a great way to put it.
Yeah.
So as we wrap up our deep dive today,
Okay.
what would you say is the key takeaway
Right.
from our exploration of these four terms?
I think it's an invitation to pay attention to the nuances of language,
Yeah.
to appreciate the layers of meaning
Right.
that are beneath the surface
Right.
of even the most common words and phrases.
Because those nuances, those layers, reveal so much about us,
Right.
about how we think, how we
Yeah,
feel,
exactly.
how we interact with the world.
And as you become more attuned to those subtleties,
Yeah.
you'll find that your communication becomes more effective,
Right.
more meaningful,
You're impactful.
and maybe even more transformative.
It's like we've been given these keys
Yeah.
to unlock these hidden treasures of language.
Mm-hmm.
And with each new word we explore,
Yeah.
we open up this whole new world of understanding.
So the next time you encounter a familiar phrase,
Yeah.
or you stumble upon a new word that sparks your curiosity,
Right.
take a moment to pause,
Yeah.
reflect,
Mm-hmm.
dive deeper into its origins, its meanings,
Right.
its potential to shape your perspective.
Because you might be surprised at what you discover.
You really might.
It's a reminder that language is constantly evolving,
It is.
full of surprises and hidden connections.
Absolutely.
Just waiting to be explored.
So keep your ears open, your minds curious,
Yes.
and your hearts open to the transformative power of language.
What a beautiful way to end our deep dive today.
Oh, thank you.
Thanks for joining us on this exploration of the English language.
It's been a pleasure.
We hope you've enjoyed the journey
I hope so.
and that you'll continue to delve into this fascinating world of words.
Yeah.
Until next time, keep exploring.